The first sound he heard was his own breathing. Shallow, rhythmic, mechanical. Each inhalation rasped through the filters of his rebreather, a ghostly whisper echoing inside the helmet that had never left his face. Around him the world was dust, a gray ocean of mud and smoke beneath a bloodless sky. The earth quivered beneath the constant barrage of distant artillery, and the air tasted of iron and ash. He could not remember how long he had been here. Days, weeks? The concept had dissolved into the constant drumbeat of bombardment, into the cold comfort of obedience. The trenches of Krieg's suns were eternal. The war was the only calendar that mattered. He adjusted his lasgun, its worn grip molded to his glove from years of repetition, and gazed toward the horizon. A no-man's land where shattered manufactorum spires jutted like broken teeth. Somewhere beyond that wasteland, the enemy waited. Chaos tainted the soil there. He could feel it in the way the air twisted, in the distant screams that carried through the wind. A shell fell nearby, close enough to shake the walls of the trench and shower him in wet soil. He did not flinch. Fear was a luxury long burned away by the doctrines drilled into him since childhood. He only checked the mechanism of his weapon, glanced toward his squad mates, silent figures in identical masks, and awaited the next order. As he stood there, motionless beneath the choking sky, a thought crept unbidden into the quiet corners of his mind. It was not a memory, not yet, just an image. A boy's hand, pale and small, tracing the cracks on a bunker wall. The sound of distant sirens, the smell of burning metal. He tried to suppress it. The past was irrelevant, but the image lingered, fragile as smoke. He remembered light, not the flicker of explosions, but real light, warm and golden. It had shone once, long ago, before the world turned to ruin. He remembered the name of a place whispered in prayer by those who had lived before the bombs fell. Krieg. He was born beneath its ashes, in the hollow shell of a dying world that had betrayed the Imperium. Born into penitence, raised to erase the sin of his ancestors with his own blood. A voice crackled through the Vox line, cold and clipped. Squad 17, forward advance, by his will. Without hesitation, the Death Corps guardsman climbed from the trench, lasgun raised, boots sinking into the mire of 1,000 dead. Around him his brothers followed, faceless, voiceless, shadows moving in unison. He was no longer a man. He was purpose made flesh, and yet, as the first shots flared across the no-man's land, he could still hear that small boy's breath. The sound of innocence, buried but not gone, beneath the hiss of his rebreather. The wind howled over the dead plain, carrying with it the reek of ozone and decay. Each gust pulled at the tattered banners impaled on the wreckage, whispering across the bones of forgotten men. And beneath that sound, hidden, almost lost in the storm, came another. A child's sob. It was faint at first, buried under the scream of distant artillery, but the guardsman heard it all the same. In the cold theater of his mind, the walls of the present began to crumble. The noise of war blurred into the echo of dripping water, and the taste of ash became the taste of dust. He was small again. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of metal and rot. The lights in the bunker flickered with a dying pulse. He sat in a corner clutching a ration tin, too young to understand why the world outside burned. The grown-ups spoke in whispers, words like rebellion, heresy, exterminatus. He didn't know what they meant. He only knew the fear in their voices. Outside, the surface of Krieg was dying. The bombs had fallen generations ago, but the radiation storm still howled across the wasteland. Whole cities lay buried under slag and cinder, and beneath them, humanity lingered, pale remnants of a world that had turned against its emperor. He remembered his mother's hands, calloused, trembling, stained with oil and soot. She worked in silence, tending to the old filtration systems that groaned like dying beasts in the tunnels. She never smiled. No one did. Joy had been outlawed the same way sunlight had. "Do not cry," she told him once, her voice dry as stone. "The Emperor does not forgive tears." He believed her. Even then, the image flickered. In the present, his boots sank deeper into the mud, the thunder of war rolling endlessly across the horizon. Yet the boy inside him remained, still sitting in that dark corner, still waiting for the world above to stop burning. He remembered the first time the sirens wailed, the call to shelter. The older men, hollow-eyed workers of the manufactorums, rushed through the tunnels with makeshift weapons. Some prayed to the Emperor. Others cursed him. Then came the quakes, the shockwaves, the collapse. He saw a man torn apart by falling steel. He saw blood for the first time. When the dust cleared, his mother was gone. Only the tin remained, dented, cold, and empty. He did not cry. He remembered her words. He remembered his duty. And in that small, ruined moment, something inside him hardened. The child who once sought comfort began to fade. He began to wait for orders, for redemption, for war. Back in the present, the Death Corps guardsman trudged forward through the mire, his mind silent again. The memory dissolved into smoke, leaving behind only the steady rhythm of his rebreather, the sound of a soul that refused to die. Ahead, the horizon burned with artillery fire. His box clicked. Advance line confirmed. "All units, prepare for charge." He gripped his weapon tighter. The boy in the bunker had waited long enough. He remembered the sound of boots, hundreds of them, striking concrete in perfect rhythm. The echo had followed him through the years, a sound of discipline, of unity, of erasure. He could not recall how he arrived there, in that subterranean compound of endless corridors and humming lights, but he remembered the coldness of it all. The walls were bare ferrocrete, the air thick with disinfectant and recycled breath. Every child wore the same gray uniform, every head shaved, every pair of eyes downcast. There were no names, only numbers. He had been given one too, stenciled on a metal plate fastened to his collar. A designation, not an identity. The instructors never called them by voice, only by command code. The voice of the commissar echoed through the loudspeakers, calm, unwavering, absolute. Krieg's redemption is eternal. The Emperor's mercy is earned in blood. Your life is a weapon. Your death is your duty. Those words became prayer, then instinct, then truth. He remembered the drills, the endless marches through the ash tunnels, the live fire exercises where failure meant punishment by isolation or worse. They were taught to dismantle and reassemble their lasguns blindfolded, to march for days without rest, to fight in total silence unless ordered otherwise. Speech was discouraged. Questions were forbidden. Emotion was weakness. One by one, the children learned to replace thought with obedience. Some resisted at first. A boy in his barracks once whispered a name, perhaps his own. The next morning, his bed was empty. No one asked where he had gone. No one ever did. He remembered the first time he fired a weapon. The recoil, the smell of ozone, the heat blooming against his cheek. A target shaped like a human silhouette fell. The instructor nodded once. That was all the approval they ever received. Over time, the memory of his mother's voice faded. Her face blurred into shadow. The boy in the bunker became a number with a rifle, and though the thought of her still lingered like a faint ember in the corners of his mind, he learned to crush it beneath the weight of duty. The training hall was a cathedral of obedience. Statues of the Emperor stood in alcoves, their eyes hollow beneath centuries of dust. Beneath their gaze, the children of Krieg prayed for death, not as an end, but as an offering. When he graduated from the academy, there was no ceremony, no applause, only a simple directive: deployment to the front lines of the 143rd Siege Regiment. He was 16 years old. Back in the present, the guardsman crouched behind a ridge of collapsed armor plating. The world around him roared with the fury of war, the air thick with chemical mist. The doctrine was still with him, guiding every movement, every breath, every shot. He whispered the prayer, the same one taught in those silent halls. To die for the Emperor is to live forever. He believed it. He had to. The smell came first. Oil, blood, and promethium carried on the wind. Then came the thunder. Artillery, endless, ceaseless. It rolled across the battlefield like the voice of a god that had long since stopped. Listening. He was 16 when he stepped onto the surface. World of Krieg. The sky was not a sky at all, just a roiling shroud of black clouds laced with lightning. The soil beneath his boots cracked and radioactive. The surface trembled beneath the pounding of orbital bombardments. The enemy were traitors, heretics born from the ashes of Krieg's rebellion, and their deaths were to be his penance. He stood in formation among thousands. The 143rd Siege Regiment arrayed like a single living organism. No shouts, no songs, just the sound of rebreathers breathing in unison, a single endless sigh of obedience. The order came through the vox. A single word. Advance. He climbed from the trench and stepped into hell. The mud clung to his legs like the dead themselves, thick and suffocating. Last fire streaked through the smog, turning shapes into silhouettes, silhouettes into corpses. He saw men fall and keep marching, their bodies still moving until gravity claimed them. The air crackled with radiation and the distant howl of dying machines. The young guardsman fired his first true shot into the void, not at a man, not at a shape, but into the sheer blinding chaos. The recoil drove into his shoulder. He felt nothing. He saw one of his squad mates, Unit 32B, struck by a shell. For an instant, the soldier's body was there. The next, it was mist and mud. The guardsman did not look away. There was no room for grief, no instinct to mourn. The commissar's voice still echoed in his skull. The flesh is transient. Duty is eternal. He advanced. Through the haze, he glimpsed the enemy for the first time. Mutants, twisted remnants of Krieg's heretical past, their bodies warped by radiation and chaos corruption. They screamed in voices that no longer belonged to men. He aimed, fired, advanced, over and over, until there was nothing left but smoke and silence. When the battle ended, he was the only one from his line still standing. Around him, the ground was carpeted with corpses, human, mutant, and unrecognizable alike. The smell of burned ozone and scorched flesh filled the air like incense. He fell to his knees, lasgun slipping from his hands, and stared at the mud. Beneath the ash, he saw something glint, a small metal plate half buried in the soil. He reached for it. It bore a number half erased by time. His number, his training tag. He could not remember dropping it. He could not remember his own name either, if he had ever had one. In that moment, the boy died. In his place stood a soldier of the Death Korps of Krieg. Back in the present, the guardsman exhaled slowly through his mask, his breath fogging the cracked lenses. The memory faded, leaving only the endless war stretching before him. He rose, reloaded, and whispered to the void, "For Krieg, for the Emperor." The thunder answered. The world they called Vardos Prime had been burning for a century. It was a fortress world once, a bastion of manufactorums and towering hab blocks. Now nothing but a planet-sized wound. For 70 years it had been under siege. For 70 years the Death Korps of Krieg had been sent to die upon its soil. He had lost count of how many days it had been. The war did not allow for calendars. The rising and setting of the red sun were the only measure of time, and even that light was dimmed by the ceaseless clouds of smoke. The trenches were endless. They snaked across the continent like scars, filled with mud that never dried and corpses that never decayed. The Guardsmen's Regiment, the 143rd Siege, had held this line for 11 standard years. 11 years of bombardment, gas attacks, and night raids. 11 years of silence. He awoke to the same sound each day, the hiss of his rebreather. He ate from the same ration pack, stale, tasteless, utilitarian. He cleaned his lasgun, repaired his trench armor, waited for orders. Sometimes he wondered if he had already died and the Emperor had forgotten to collect him. The officers came rarely. The commissars even less. Most of them had died months ago, swallowed by the same mud that consumed the rest. Command was now relayed through Vox transmissions, curt, static-filled orders that never changed. Advance, dig, hold. He remembered one battle in particular, though battle was too generous a word. It was a slow starvation of the soul. The enemy artillery never stopped. Shells screamed down from the heavens day and night, turning the front line into a churning ocean of death. When his trench collapsed one night, he spent 6 hours buried to his waist, clawing through the mud with frozen fingers. Around him, others were buried fully, some still breathing, their muffled cries blending with the wind. He did not try to save them. He had no strength left to spare. When he finally dug himself free, dawn had come. If dawn could exist on a world where the sun was red and the air was poison. He looked around at what remained of his unit. 4 men, all silent, all breathing through cracked masks. He remembered one of them handing him a battered canteen, its contents long frozen into slush. Neither spoke. They simply shared the canteen, took a sip each, and turned back toward the line. There was no camaraderie here. No friendship, only function. Each man was a tool. Each death was a debt repaid. Each moment of life was another chance to earn the Emperor's forgiveness. He moved through his duties with precision, repairing fortifications, digging new trenches through the carcasses of old ones, setting mines in the mud. Every motion was an act of worship. Every breath was a prayer. At night, he sometimes stared at the sky. No stars could be seen through the haze, only the dim glow of orbital fire. But in the flicker of the explosions, he sometimes saw faces in the clouds, not of his comrades, not even of his mother. Just faces, unknown, uncounted, fading as quickly as they appeared. And always, when the wind was quiet, he could still hear that child's breathing, the echo of innocence that refused to die completely. Then the vox crackled once more, and duty returned. 17th line, prepare for assault. By his will, we advance. He rose from the mud, checked the charge on his laser gun, and moved forward into the smoke. The machine of war turned, and he turned with it. There were no mirrors on Krieg. There was no need for them. The guardsman had not seen his face since his initiation, not truly. The rebreather was his identity now, a permanent mask sealed by faith and habit. The skin beneath it was pale and brittle, untouched by sunlight for decades. He no longer cared what it looked like. Faces were for the living. He was not among them. In the trenches of Vardos Prime, men of other regiments sometimes arrived, replacements, allies, or the desperate remnants of worlds still capable of fear. They stared at the Death Corps with unease, whispering of their silence, their unbreakable calm. Some called them ghosts. Others called them the Emperor's revenants. They weren't wrong. Once, during a lull in the bombardment, a Cadian trooper had asked him, half in jest, half in terror, whether the Death Corps truly wanted to die. He had not answered. Words were unnecessary. Instead, he simply adjusted his bayonet and looked toward the horizon where the next charge would come from. The Cadian said nothing more. For the Krieg guardsman, death was not an end. It was the completion of purpose. To die in service was to balance the scales of ancestral guilt, the ancient betrayal of Krieg's rebellion against the Imperium, a sin that could never be forgotten. Each Krieg-born soul carried that weight from birth, a generational curse carved into their collective consciousness. He remembered the sermons of the chaplains in the training halls. We were born into sin. We live to erase it. We die to be worthy again. And so they lived as the dead do, without joy, without rest, without hesitation. He had seen men impaled on the barbed wreckage of fortifications and still fire their weapons until their last breath. He had seen soldiers crawl across the mud with shattered legs, still carrying munitions forward. None cried for medics. None begged for mercy, because there was none. Even their burial rites were efficient, if one could call them that. When a guardsman fell, his body was stripped of equipment, the serial number recorded, and then covered by the same mud he had fought upon. No words, no markers, only the hiss of the rebreather lines continuing around him. A mechanical choir of perseverance. He sometimes imagined the ground beneath the trenches, layer upon layer of Krieg bodies pressed into the earth, forming a foundation of bone upon which new soldiers stood. The thought did not disturb him. It comforted him. It meant they were never alone. There was a saying among the Death Corps: "We do not die for victory. We die so others may fight tomorrow." He believed it. He had to. At night, when the shell fire faded and the battlefield slept, he would sit beside the wreck of a tank, his hands resting on his laser gun like a priest's upon an altar. He would stare into the fog and listen to the sound of the wind whispering through helmets half buried in the dirt. Sometimes he thought they whispered his name. But he had no name, only a number. And numbers, like soldiers, were meant to be replaced. The bombardment had ceased for the first time in weeks. Silence spread across the front line like an unfamiliar contagion, unnerving in its absence. The guardsman sat in the mud beside a shattered communications post, his weapon resting against his shoulder, his mind empty but alert. The air was thick with the scent of decay, rust, ash, and the faint sweetness of rot. Across the trench, a flare guttered out, leaving only the faint light of phosphor lamps trembling in the fog. That was when he saw him. The chaplain, though the title seemed almost mythic now, was sitting against the trench wall. His armor cracked and blackened, his mask shattered to reveal the pallid ruin of a face beneath. The insignia of the imperial aquila was still visible on his chest plate, scorched but intact. He was old, impossibly so. His voice, when it came, was a rasping whisper filtered through a failing vox bead. "You there?" "Soldier." The guardsman approached, his boots sinking into the waterlogged ground. He stood at attention, silent, waiting for orders. The chaplain's ruined eyes studied him through the haze. "Your number?" He recited it automatically, his voice flat, mechanical. "Good," the chaplain murmured. "You remember it. That means you still exist. Most of them forget before the end." He coughed, a wet broken sound, and blood trickled through the cracks of his rebreather. "Tell me, guardsman, do you believe?" The question felt strange. Belief was not a concept they spoke of. Duty replaced faith, obedience replaced prayer, but the old man's tone was not one of reprimand. It was weary, pleading. The guardsman hesitated, his voice low. "I serve." The chaplain smiled, or something close to it. "Yes, we all serve, but service without belief is hollow." He gestured weakly toward the sky, that churning canopy of smoke and fire. "Once I thought the Emperor watched us from above. Now I think he watches through us, through the ones who do not stop." The guardsman said nothing. He did not know how to answer a dying priest. "Do you know why we wear masks, son?" The chaplain continued, his voice fading to a whisper. "It is not to hide. It is to remind us that penance has no face. That redemption belongs to no man, only to mankind." The old priest's breathing grew ragged. "But sometimes, I wonder if he remembers us. If he still counts our dead." A shell screamed in the distance, striking somewhere far behind their line. The earth trembled briefly, then stilled again. The guardsman knelt beside the chaplain, unsure why. Perhaps it was habit, or perhaps it was that small, silent part of him that still remembered the warmth of a mother's hand. The priest looked at him one last time, his gaze unfocused but calm. "If you see him, Kriegborn, tell him we never stopped." His hand twitched once, then stilled. The faint hum of his vox faded into nothing. The guardsman remained there for a long while, the old man's words echoing through the chambers of his mind. Then, without a word, he reached forward and closed the chaplain's eyes. He took the rosarius from the corpse's chest, a small, broken symbol of the Aquila, and placed it in his satchel beside a dented ration tin. 2 relics from 2 lives. When the vox crackled once more with the next order, he rose, slung his rifle, and walked back into the fog. The silence followed him. Dawn came as a colorless smear on the horizon, if it could be called dawn at all. The sky was the same roiling bruise it had always been, a slow-motion explosion that never ended. A new order rippled through the vox channels, cold and impersonal as the hiss of static. "All units, advance, no reserves." It was a phrase every Krieg soldier knew by heart, a command with no return built into it. The guardsman rose from the trench and joined the line. Thousands moved beside him in absolute silence, their movements mechanical, the sound of their rebreathers blending into one great metallic pulse. The mud swallowed their boots. The fog parted only when shells tore it open. They carried bayonets fixed and charges primed. The world before them, once the enemy's fortress line, was a jagged wasteland of steel ribs and molten glass. There was no hope of victory here. The objective was attrition itself, to break the enemy's spirit by showing them the Emperor's soldiers had none left to break. The first barrage fell among them. Dozens vanished in sprays of mud and fire. The rest kept marching. No screams, no hesitation, only the rhythm of feet and breath. It was not courage. It was conditioning refined into faith. He fired only when shapes appeared through the smoke, silhouettes writhing in corrupted armor, heretics shrieking oaths to false gods. He shot until his pack was empty, reloaded, kept moving. When a blast flung him into a crater, he climbed out without a thought. He saw a standard bearer ahead of him, the banner of Krieg half torn and burning. The soldier holding it staggered, then fell. Without breaking stride, the guardsman seized the haft before it hit the ground. The fabric hissed in the wind, its symbol half consumed by fire, but it still stood. They reached the enemy trench at last. Bayonets met flesh. The world shrank to flashes of red light, to the sound of metal and mud. The guardsman felt something tear in his side, a blade perhaps, or shrapnel, but there was no pain, only pressure. He drove his rifle forward again and again until the shape before him stopped moving. When the charge finally faltered, only a few 12 remained. They did not retreat. They formed a new line amid the ruin, dug into the corpses and ash, reloaded what ammunition they could scavenge, and waited. Always waiting. As dusk swallowed the battlefield, the guardsman stood amid the wreckage, banner still in hand. The cloth smoldered, shedding faint embers that drifted upward into the dark. He looked to the sky. No stars, no Emperor's light, only the dull reflection of the fires below. For a moment, he wondered if this was what faith looked like from the other side. An endless march into smoke, a devotion measured in footsteps, not victories. Then the vox clicked again. Hold position. By his will, he obeyed. It arrived not as peace, but as absence, the sudden void left behind when the world forgets to scream. The bombardment had ended hours ago, though time no longer mattered. There was no day, no night, only a continuous dusk, broken by the slow hiss of leaking promethium and the soft clicks of dying weapons. The guardsman sat alone in a crater large enough to bury a tank. Around him, the bodies of his regiment lay in grotesque stillness, masks cracked, hands still clutching rifles that would never fire again. The air stank of ozone and burnt metal. Above, the clouds churned without motion, their bellies reflecting the orange glow of smoldering wreckage below. He listened to the sound of his own breath echoing through the rebreather. It was rhythmic, steady, mechanical, the sound of life pretending to continue. Once he had feared this silence. Now it was familiar, almost sacred. He reached for his canteen and found it empty. His fingers brushed against the identification tag of the soldier beside him, half buried in mud. He hesitated before pulling it free, wiping the grime from the engraved number. Then, without ceremony, he placed it into the pouch on his belt, the same pouch that held dozens more. Each one was a promise, a burden carried forward. He did not remember their names. He never knew them. That was not the point. Each tag represented a life given to balance Krieg's ancient sin, a tally in an endless penance. As he stared at the bodies, fragments of memory began to surface, disjointed, flickering like the afterglow of a flare. A boy standing in a ruined city, ash falling like snow. The distant voice of a commissar reading from the Book of Remembrance. A steel door closing, sealing hundreds inside a bunker as the world above them burned. The flashbacks came often after battle. They were ghosts, not of the dead, but of himself. Pieces of a past he had been ordered to forget. He remembered his first march. The weight of the lasgun unfamiliar in his hands. The way the instructors spoke of redemption as though it were oxygen. Your ancestors betrayed the Emperor. You will not. You will fight until there is nothing left to fight with. He had believed them. He still did. A faint movement drew his attention. Across the crater, a wounded soldier stirred. One of his regiment, mask shattered, eyes staring blankly through the smoke. The man's chest rose and fell shallowly, each breath a struggle. The guardsman crawled toward him through the mud, his side wound throbbing with every motion. When he reached the fallen comrade, he saw that the man's left arm was gone. The blood had already clotted black beneath the armor. Krieg, the dying man rasped. The word was not a question. It was a farewell. The guardsman nodded once and placed a hand on the man's shoulder. There was no need for prayer. The act of dying was the prayer. When the body stilled, he sat back in silence. The fog closing in again. Somewhere far beyond the smoke, artillery resumed, distant, faint, like thunder remembered in a dream. The next offensive was already beginning. He would move when ordered. He would fight until there was nothing left of him to obey. He was Death Corps. He did not die for victory. He lived only to die well. No man's land stretched before him like a corpse the size of a world. It breathed smoke, exhaled silence, and swallowed sound. The guardsman moved through it alone. The battle had rolled onward without him, the living tide of Krieg and chaos colliding somewhere beyond the gray horizon. What was left behind were ruins of both. Shells lay half buried in the mud, their steel ribs jutting out like the bones of titans. Twisted corpses, human and heretic alike, merged into the landscape, indistinguishable beneath the crust of soot. The fog was thicker here, dense with the taste of rust and death. Every step sank inches into the black sludge, releasing bubbles of foul vapor that hissed against his rebreather filters. He advanced without direction, not toward victory, not toward command, only forward. That was all a Krieg soldier ever knew. Sometimes he saw motion in the mist. flickers of movement at the edge of sight. The shadows of men who were not there. At first he dismissed them as illusions caused by exhaustion or gas. But as he walked deeper into the wasteland, the phantoms began to take form. They wore the same greatcoats, the same masks, the same number burned into the shoulder plates. His number. They didn't speak. They merely watched as he passed, still, silent, and infinite. The ghosts of Krieg did not haunt for malice. They haunted to remind. He tried to recall his regiment's name, their company number, the designation of the world they were meant to conquer. The memories slipped away like smoke. He realized with a hollow certainty that none of it mattered. The Death Corps fought on countless worlds that all looked the same. Scorched earth, broken sky, endless mud. Each battlefield was another graveyard. Each victory another debt unpaid. He came upon a crater filled with stagnant water, reflecting the bruised heavens above. The reflection trembled with every shell that fell miles away. He stared into it and saw himself, the mask cracked down the middle, the lenses fogged from within. For the first time he removed it. The air burned his throat. His face beneath was pale, drawn, expressionless, as though sculpted from ash. The skin bore faint scars of radiation burns from Krieg's early centuries of ruin. He hardly recognized it. It wasn't a face, merely a reminder that he was still tethered to mortality. He looked down at the reflection again, but the image had changed. The water no longer showed his features. It showed a boy, wide-eyed, hair-shorn, standing in the ruins of a bombed-out city. He remembered that moment now, the smell of scorched soil, the sound of sirens echoing through tunnels. He remembered his mother's voice, faint, telling him to hide before the ceiling fell. And then, nothing. He blinked, and the image was gone. The boy dissolved into ripples. The man who remained replaced his mask, sealing away the last fragment of humanity he had left. Above him, the storm deepened. Artillery flares arced across the sky like dying comets. The horizon trembled with the march of tanks and the drone of engines. His Vox unit crackled faintly, a broken signal, distant, indistinct. Unit, regroup, Emperor's will. He adjusted his rifle and began walking toward the sound. Not because he expected to find anyone alive, but because that was what he was made for. In the Death Corps, there were no deserters, only those not yet found by death. And somewhere in the fog, death was waiting for him still. The signal grew stronger as he moved through the wasteland, each burst of static a pulse in the dark, drawing him onward. It wasn't clear or human anymore, warped by distance and decay, but it was there, like a heartbeat refusing to die. He followed it across the field of wreckage until he reached what had once been a command post. The structure leaned sideways, half swallowed by the earth, its walls blackened and split by artillery fire. A rusted Vox array jutted from the rubble like a broken spire, still crackling faintly in the smog. He stepped inside. The air was heavy with the stench of burnt oil and old blood. Bent metal shelves lined the walls, covered in dust and spent casings. Maps had fused to the tables, their surfaces bubbled and warped by heat. The faint light of a dying lumen cast long shadows across the chamber, flickering like candlelight in a mausoleum. At the center of the room sat a figure slumped over a transmitter. The corpse wore an officer's coat, its insignia long erased by fire. The Vox bead still clung to the skull, wires burrowed deep into the bone. The guardsman stared at it for a long moment, listening to the sound of the machine that refused to stop whispering. Hold position, by his will. The same order, the same tone, the same deathless command that echoed across every Krieg battlefield. He realized then that it had been repeating. Perhaps for years, perhaps for decades. He turned the dial. The signal shifted, fragmented, then merged again into the same phrase, the same eternal directive. Hold position. By his will. It was all that remained of command. A ghost order, looping forever in the static of a war that no longer had victors. He sank to one knee beside the dead officer. The rebreather hummed softly, its filters wheezing with exhaustion. The weight of the endless repetition pressed down upon him, not despair, but something deeper. The understanding that this was all there would ever be. They would keep fighting because they had been told to fight. And in the absence of new orders, they would continue until the last man's bones turned to dust. He reached out and switched off the Vox unit. The silence that followed felt like blasphemy. For the first time in his life, there was no voice commanding him, no signal to obey. The quiet was absolute. He looked at the corpse beside him and imagined that once, long ago, this officer had turned off his own mask to speak his final words. Maybe he had prayed. Maybe he had just listened to the wind, as he was now. The guardsman stood, his movements deliberate. The faint hum of his gear echoed against the steel walls. He picked up a data slate from the table, its surface shattered but still legible. It bore the seal of the 143rd Siege Regiment. He wasn't of that regiment. He wasn't sure if his regiment still existed. Outside, the wind screamed through the ruins like a dying hymn. He walked out into the open again, the world spreading before him like a wound that would never close. He looked back once at the bunker, at the dead officer still seated in his chair, at the silent vox machine that had once commanded the faithful to their graves. Then he spoke, his voice muffled beneath the rebreather. Order received. He turned toward the front, though there was no front left to find, and began to march. He marched. The mud clung to his boots like the weight of a promise he no longer remembered making. The fog never lifted, only shifted, like a shroud breathing over the world. The sun, if it still existed, was a myth beyond the haze. For hours, perhaps days, he walked without direction. His steps were measured, automatic, the same pace drilled into him since birth. The hum of the rebreather was his only companion, a hollow lullaby of machinery pretending to be breath. The absence of orders had become a presence in itself, something vast and suffocating, pressing against his mind like an unseen hand. He thought of the Vox signal, of that endless loop repeating hold position. By his will, it had been his world, his reason to move. Now there was only silence. He should have felt free. He did not. Without the voice of command, the rhythm faltered. Duty was supposed to give purpose, to fill the void. But what was a soldier when obedience was no longer required? He slowed, boots sinking into the muck. The battlefield around him was endless, a graveyard without edges. The corpses of tanks loomed like monuments, and the bones of the fallen jutted through the mud like the roots of a poisoned forest. He reached one of the larger wrecks, an old Lehman Russ, its hull split open by plasma fire. He climbed atop it, standing high above the field, and for the first time in years, looked out without an order to dictate his sight. There was no enemy line, no fortification, no signal flare to guide him, only desolation, stretching forever. He removed his helmet, letting the air sting his scarred face. The world smelled of rust, ash, and rot, the scent of eternity. A memory surfaced unbidden. He was young again, barely 12, standing in the underhalls of Krieg, watching the parade of soldiers marching past, their masks gleaming, their boots aligned in perfect rhythm. He had wanted to be one of them, not for glory, not for escape, but because it was the only path offered. He remembered the commissar's voice echoing through the chamber. You are not men. You are restitution. You are the Emperor's penance made flesh. And he had believed it, because belief was all they had. Now, standing alone among the wreckage, he wondered if penance ever ended, or if they were simply the forgotten machinery of guilt, wound up and left to march until rust claimed them. The wind rose, carrying whispers across the field, not real voices, but the memory of them. The murmur of ranks long gone, of the dead murmuring beneath the soil. He closed his eyes and listened. For a heartbeat, it almost sounded like a hymn. Then it was gone. He put the helmet back on, the seal clicking shut with a final hiss. The world returned to its familiar hum. He checked his rifle. The charge cell was low but not empty. He tightened the strap of his gear, straightened his posture, and began walking again. Not because he knew where to go, but because motion was the only thing left that still resembled faith. Somewhere ahead, through the fog, the faintest light pulsed. Maybe it was artillery. Maybe it was dawn. He did not care which. He marched toward it. The light turned out not to be artillery. It was smaller, fragile, flickering like a candle struggling to live in a world made of wind and ruin. He saw it first through the fog, a faint amber glow seeping from the broken shell of a hab block half swallowed by the mud. Instinct made him raise his rifle, scanning the ruin for movement. None came. The silence of death ruled here as surely as on any world Krieg had ever burned. He approached cautiously, boots squelching through the thick mire. The building's upper floors were gone, pulverized by shell fire, but a narrow stairwell led down into the earth, into shadow. The light came from below. He descended, rifle raised, finger poised. The air grew warmer as he went, a strange sensation, almost forgotten. It smelled of old smoke and damp earth, and beneath it, faintly, something impossible. Food. At the bottom of the stairs, he found a small chamber, a forgotten shelter. The walls were blackened with soot, and the remains of old rations and shattered crates lay scattered across the floor. In the center, a makeshift lantern burned weakly, its flame dancing inside a cracked glass casing. Beside it sat a child. The guardsman froze. She couldn't have been older than 10. Thin, hollow-eyed, dressed in rags that might once have been a civilian uniform. Her face was streaked with dirt, her hair matted, but her gaze was alive. When she saw him, she didn't scream. She only stared, wide-eyed, the way one might look at a myth suddenly made flesh. For a long moment, neither moved. Then she whispered, voice trembling, "Are you here to take me?" The question was so small, so human, that it cut through him like shrapnel. He lowered the rifle slowly, the gesture foreign, almost hesitant. "I don't know," he said. His own voice sounded strange to him, filtered through the mask, shaped by years of silence. She blinked, uncertain whether he had spoken at all. "Are you one of them?" she asked again, quieter now. "The ones who keep fighting?" He looked at her, at the frail spark of life flickering in the darkness, something he had not seen in years, perhaps in decades. "Yes," he answered. "I am." The girl nodded as if that explained everything. She motioned toward the lantern. "You can sit. The fire, it helps." He hesitated only a moment before moving closer, lowering himself beside her. The floor was cold stone. The warmth of the tiny flame barely reached through the chill, but it was something. She pushed a tin cup toward him, what remained of a ration. "You can have it. I already ate." He didn't take it. He simply watched the fire. "How long have you been here?" he asked. "I don't know," she said softly. "The others left or died. The men with the masks came once. They didn't see me." He looked down at his own mask. The lenses reflected the flame like two dying suns. "I am one of them," he said again, though now it felt like a confession. She tilted her head, studying him. "You don't sound like them." He said nothing. Outside, the wind howled through the ruins, a deep and distant voice that had once commanded armies. Down here, the two of them sat in fragile silence, a soldier who had forgotten his face and a child who had never learned to hide hers. The fire sputtered, shrinking. Instinct made him reach for his ration kit. He tore open a flare and broke off a piece of its compound, feeding it to the lantern. The light grew brighter, steady again. The girl's eyes widened in wonder. "You saved it." He stared into the flame. "No," he murmured. "I delayed it." He didn't sleep that night. The child did, curled against the wall beside the faint glow of the lantern, breathing softly in the stale air. The guardsman sat awake, his rifle across his knees, eyes fixed on the narrow stairwell above. The war had taught him that silence never lasted. Sooner or later, something always came. Orders, gunfire, or death. It was only a question of which would arrive first. He studied the girl while she slept. Her face was peaceful, untouched by the rituals of war. She belonged to a different world, a world that had once known warmth, laughter, and names that meant something. He tried to remember his own. Nothing came. He reached into his pouch, pulling free the cluster of identification tags. Dozens of cold metal fragments clinked softly in the gloom. Each one carried the number of a man who had died obeying. A man who had believed the only redemption was annihilation. For the first time, he felt their weight. He looked at the child again and thought of how easily the next shell, the next stray patrol, could erase her. She didn't understand this world, didn't know that it fed on innocence like her own. He should have left already. That was what protocol demanded. Civilians were irrelevant. Non-combatants were liabilities. The war cared for nothing but obedience, and yet he remained. When she woke, her first words were a whisper. "You didn't go." He paused before answering. "No, why?" He searched for the answer among the fragments of his thoughts. "Because..." He stopped, realizing he didn't have the words. "Because you're still alive." She smiled faintly, as if that were enough. Then her expression dimmed. "You'll get in trouble." "Perhaps." She hesitated, then asked quietly, "Can I come with you?" The question hung between them, heavier than any order. He thought of the endless march, of the fields littered with gas-masked corpses, of men who charged into artillery for glory they would never see. He thought of the voice that had looped through the Vox, repeating the same command across eternity. And for the first time in his life, he realized he had the power to choose. "Yes," he said. Her eyes brightened. "Where are we going?" He looked toward the ruined stairwell and the ash-colored sky beyond. "Away from here." It wasn't an answer, but it was enough. They gathered what little they could. Rations, the lantern, a small blanket. He wrapped her in his greatcoat, adjusting the straps so her small hands could grip the edge of his armor. When they climbed the stairs, the wind hit them like a cold baptism. The world above was gray and endless as ever, but the fog seemed thinner now, the light above less cruel. She clung to his arm, eyes darting across the ruins. "Is it over?" she asked. He looked at the horizon, where distant flashes still burned like stars that refused to die. "No," he said softly. "Not yet." A faint sound rose through the wind, a low mechanical hum. The kind that came from Vox arrays awakening, their range vast, their reach eternal. Then the voice came through the static, familiar, unyielding. "All units, advance, no reserves." He stopped walking. The words pierced the fog like scripture. The child looked up at him, sensing the change in his stance. "Do you have to go?" she asked. He stared into the mist, into the direction the order came from. For a long, terrible moment, every instinct screamed obedience. Every fiber of his being urged him to march. But then he felt her hand tighten around his glove. Small, fragile, human. He turned away from the sound. "No," he said. And with that single word, the endless war, at least his part of it, began to fracture. They moved into the mist together, one step at a time. The wind howled across the plain, dragging long ribbons of ash that slithered between the ruined trenches like ghosts of the fallen. The guardsman trudged forward, the child pressed against his chest beneath his greatcoat, her breathing soft but steady. Each step sank into the mire, the sludge of bone and dust that had once been men, once been cities. For hours they walked through the silence. No gunfire, no shells, just the distant rhythmic pounding of artillery somewhere far behind them, the heartbeat of a war that refused to die. He should have felt relief. Instead, he felt hunted. The Vox commands had gone silent now, but he knew what silence meant. The eyes of Krieg were upon him. Somewhere, his transponder code had already been marked as non-compliant. A sin, unspoken but absolute. A Death Corps guardsman does not disobey. He had done more than disobey. He had chosen compassion. When they stopped to rest beneath the wreckage of a half-collapsed bunker, the girl leaned against his arm. "Why are you shaking?" she whispered. He looked down, realizing his hands trembled. Not from fear, or at least not the kind he understood. It was the tremor of something reawakening inside him, something long buried under layers of duty and pain. He remembered for a fleeting instant the warmth of another hand, smaller, fragile. The flashback came unbidden. A young boy standing in a steel corridor clutching a ration tin as a commissar's voice echoed through the training hall. "You are not children. You are penance. You are the ashes made flesh." The boy had nodded. He'd believed it. The memory faded, swallowed by the present. He looked at the girl now, so similar in age to what he once was, and wondered how many lives had been erased by those same words. A faint sound broke the wind, a mechanical hum, closer this time. He froze. The girl followed his gaze toward the horizon. 3 silhouettes were emerging from the fog, Krieg pattern respirators, long trench coats, Lazarifles at the ready, his brothers. They advanced in perfect formation, feet falling in unison, rifles low but prepared. One of them lifted a hand, signaling. The familiar voice came through the Vox, cold and hollow beneath the static. "Identify yourself." He hesitated. The name, the number, the rank, all still in his mind. But to speak them aloud would be to surrender the illusion that he had escaped. The second figure stepped forward, visor glinting in the ashen light. "You are out of formation," the voice said flatly. "Your squad was reported lost at trench line 17. You have abandoned your post." He didn't answer. The lead guardsman tilted his head. "And the child?" The air thickened. The girl clutched his arm tighter. "She is not of Krieg," came the final voice, quieter but heavier. "Protocol demands elimination." Something in him snapped. Not with rage, but with clarity. He realized what this moment was, not an act of rebellion, but revelation. He had not saved the girl from war. She had saved him from obedience. He drew his rifle slowly, but not to aim. He laid it in the mud, muzzle down. "I am finished fighting," he said through the mask. For a moment, no one moved. Then the leading soldier raised his laser gun, the motion practiced, ceremonial. "Desertion is heresy," he said. The girl's voice broke the silence. "Don't hurt him!" Her words, small and trembling, echoed in the empty world. The soldiers didn't answer. They weren't built for empathy. They were instruments, carved from guilt and bred for absolution through death. But the one in front hesitated. The faintest tilt of the head, a pause just long enough to betray something almost human. Then he lowered his weapon. "This never happened," he said. "You were lost with the rest." The others turned to him, their confusion hidden behind filters and lenses. But they obeyed. Without another word, the squad vanished back into the fog, their figures swallowed by the ash and wind. Ghosts returning to their penance. He stood there, stunned, the silence ringing in his ears. The girl looked up at him. "They let us go," she whispered. He nodded slowly. "For now." The wind carried away the sound of his voice, leaving only the steady thrum of the distant war. He realized then that mercy in Krieg was rarer than victory, and far more dangerous. He lifted the child into his arms and continued walking. The fog parted briefly, revealing a sky the color of faded steel, and somewhere beyond the gray horizon, the first rays of pale light touched the ruined earth. For the first time in his life, he hoped the dawn might last. The day stretched long and cold across the wasteland, the kind of light that never warmed, only revealed. The guardsman moved through the gray expanse like a specter, the child wrapped in his greatcoat, her head resting against his shoulder. Each step carried the weight of unspoken defiance, the kind that had no place in Krieg's doctrine. The wind whispered against his respirator, dragging dust into his coat seams, and for a time it almost felt as if the world itself had gone still. No artillery, no orders, no voices from the Vox. Only the sound of his boots crunching on bone and glass. But Krieg never allowed silence for long. By midday, he saw it, a burned-out convoy, the skeletal remains of supply trucks and shattered armor half buried in the earth. Scavengers had already been there, gnawed cables, spent casings, bodies stripped of rations. Yet something else glimmered beneath the wreckage, the blackened insignia of the Imperial Aquila, a forward command post. He approached cautiously, the girl clinging tighter. Inside the hollowed ruin, the stench of promethium and death lingered. Vox units crackled faintly, repeating the same signal over and over, a distress beacon, automated, forgotten. The voice looped through static. "This is command. Sector lost. Reinforcements. Emperor, preserve us." The words had been echoing for weeks, maybe months. No one had come. No one ever would. He found a cracked data slate among the wreckage, logs, troop movements, requisition lists. At the end, a report caught his eye. Krieg 145th Siege Regiment, morale collapse, desertion reported, purge authorized. His throat tightened. The order had already been given. Somewhere, even now, a commissar or field marshal was ensuring the decree was carried out. There would be no pardon, no hiding. The Death Corps did not forgive. He sank to his knees, staring at the text until it blurred. The child touched his arm. "What is it?" He wanted to lie, to tell her they were safe, that the war couldn't reach them anymore. But he had already spoken too many lies in his life. "They'll come," he said quietly. "They always do." The girl frowned, confusion flickering in her eyes. "Then we'll run again." He shook his head. "No, you'll run." "I'll stay." She froze. "No." He turned to her, the lenses of his mask reflecting the faint glow of the dying fire. "You have a chance to live. That's more than most." Her voice trembled. "You saved me. You can come too." He wanted to. Emperor help him, he wanted to. But even now, as he stared into the horizon, he felt the weight of what he was. a creation of Krieg, a man built from dust and guilt, whose life had meaning only in sacrifice. The sound of engines reached them before the light did. The familiar grind of treads moving through mud, a baneblade, maybe two, and the rhythmic march of boots, hundreds of them. He rose, placing his rifle in her small hands. "When they come, you go east," he said. "Follow the sun. Keep walking until the air smells like rain." She clutched the weapon, eyes wide. "What about you?" He didn't answer. Instead, he pressed something into her palm. One of his dog tags, the metal warm from his touch. "Keep it," he said, "so they remember someone tried." She looked down at it, tears cutting lines through the dust on her face. "I don't understand." He placed a gloved hand against her cheek, awkward, almost mechanical. "Neither do I," he said softly. Then he stood and stepped out into the wind. The horizon burned with motion, the silhouettes of advancing Krieg infantry, trenchcoats rippling, masks glinting. At their head, a commissar in black armor raised a power sword that gleamed with promise. The guardsman took a deep breath. The last he might ever take. He reached to his belt and pulled a single charge pack from his kit, sliding it into his las rifle with practiced ease. His stance shifted, not in defiance, but in prayer. He had spent his whole life killing for redemption. Now perhaps he could die for mercy. The first volley lit the sky like lightning. When the smoke cleared, the bunker was gone. Only the ruins remained. And among them, a single respirator half buried in the ash, its lenses shattered but reflecting faint sunlight. Far away, beyond the horizon, a child walked eastward beneath a pale sky. The tag in her hand caught the light, glinting once before disappearing into the mist. And though the war raged on, for the first time in uncounted years, a soul from Krieg found peace. Years passed and the war moved on. Like a storm that never ended, it rolled across worlds and names until even the echoes of that forgotten battlefield were swallowed by new campaigns. The Imperium did not mourn its soldiers. It merely replaced them. But somewhere, far from the irradiated ruins of Krieg, beyond the reach of its endless penance, a girl grew up beneath a gentler sky. The air here smelled of rain. She remembered that smell, because he had spoken of it once, not as a soldier, but as a man who had dreamed of something more than orders and graves. She had not known his name, only his voice through the filter of his respirator. The way it grew softer when he spoke to her, as if unsure whether he still had the right to sound human. The small settlement that had taken her in was humble, a cluster of haves on the edge of an agri-world, where soil still bore fruit and clouds carried the promise of water instead of poison. She learned to till fields, to mend roofs, to live quietly. The people there did not ask about her past. They saw only the haunted stillness in her eyes and the metal tag she never took off. On nights when the wind blew cold, she would sit beneath the old irrigation towers and stare toward the stars. Sometimes, in the faint hum of machinery, she swore she could still hear the echo of his voice. "Keep walking until the air smells like rain." She never forgot. One morning, while gathering supplies at the trade port, she saw them, the soldiers. Imperial Guard, fresh recruits moving through the square in full parade. Among them marched a detachment in long gray coats, their masks expressionless, their movements flawless, the death corps of Krieg. She froze. For a moment, time folded back on itself. The screams, the smoke, the hand that had shielded her from shrapnel. She wanted to run to them, to demand to know if they remembered, if any of them carried the same number, the same regiment, the same soul. But she didn't, because even then, she knew the truth. Krieg did not remember its dead. It became them. As the column passed, one soldier turned his head ever so slightly, his visor catching the light. It was a small gesture, but it was enough to make her breath catch. She touched the dog tag around her neck, worn, pitted with rust, and whispered his name, though she had never known it. The parade moved on. The square fell silent again. That night, when the moon rose over the fields, she planted something new in the soil. A small seed she had found in the wreckage long ago, preserved in a vial marked only with the sigil of Krieg. She buried it carefully, her hands trembling. Days passed. Then, one morning, she saw it, a single pale flower pushing through the dirt, fragile yet defiant, swaying in the soft wind. She smiled. For the first time, she no longer felt like the last survivor of a war. She felt like the first witness of something reborn, and somewhere, beyond the veil of life and death, where the souls of soldiers marched eternally through ash and silence. Perhaps one among them turned his head and saw her and remembered the rain. The years rolled onward, slow and patient as the turning of the soil. The flower she planted had multiplied, spreading its pale blossoms across the field, each one a quiet rebellion against the world that had once burned her home to ash. Sometimes travelers passed through the settlement, traders, pilgrims, soldiers between wars. They would speak of distant campaigns, of horrors that had swallowed worlds whole, of heroes whose names were lost before the ink on their commendations had dried. But one night, a different kind of visitor arrived. He came on foot, his trench coat frayed at the hem, his mask cracked at the edge of one lens. His uniform was old, older than hers had ever seen, and his voice when he spoke carried the rasp of filtered dust. "Is this the place?" he asked softly. The woman, no longer a girl, looked up from the field she was tending. "The place for what?" He paused, scanning the endless spread of pale flowers. "The place where he fell." She felt her heart tighten. "Who?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his coat and withdrew a weathered piece of parchment. Its edges crumbling, the ink faded, but still legible enough to make out the sigil of the Astra Militarum. Regimental record. Krieg, 145th Siege. Regiment status. Eradicated in the field of penance. Cause, self-inflicted purge. Addendum, 1 casualty unrecorded. Designation missing. Mask unnumbered. Weapon unclaimed. The woman touched the paper as if afraid it would vanish. "How did you find this?" The stranger tilted his head. "The dead of Krieg never truly vanish," he said. "Sometimes we leave questions behind. I have followed his for many years." She studied him, the way his shoulders sagged, the way his words carried exhaustion rather than menace. "You knew him?" "No," the soldier said, "but I knew what he did." He knelt beside the flowers, gloved hands brushing gently across the petals. "They told us once that compassion was weakness, that mercy was a luxury the damned could not afford. But someone proved otherwise." She swallowed, voice trembling. "They still remember him?" A faint hiss escaped the respirator, not quite a sigh, but close. "Among the Death Corps, there is a story whispered in the barracks after lights out, of a man who turned his back on the Vox and vanished into the fog. They call him the Penitent. Some say he lost his mind. Others say he found his soul." The woman knelt beside him, eyes glistening in the dim light. "He saved me," she whispered. The soldier turned, his cracked lens reflecting her face. Then perhaps that was enough. He stood, pulling a small metal object from his pouch, a respirator filter, blackened and scored with age. "This was found near the field of penance. The number is gone, worn smooth, but I think it belonged to him." He placed it gently at the base of the tallest flower. The two of them stood in silence, the wind carrying the faint scent of rain through the night. After a while, he spoke again, softer this time. "You've done more than he ever dreamed possible. You gave this place life," she smiled faintly. "He gave me the chance." The soldier nodded once. Then, with slow precision, he raised a hand in salute, not to her, but to the empty horizon. "For the Emperor," he said quietly, "and for the one who remembered what that was supposed to mean." Then he turned and disappeared into the mist, leaving only footprints in the damp soil, footprints that the rain soon washed away. The woman watched him go, then looked down at the flower bed. Beneath the shifting petals, the filter lay half-buried, glinting faintly in the starlight. She knelt, whispered a prayer she didn't fully understand, and pressed her palm to the earth. "Rest now," she said. "You're forgiven." Above her, thunder rolled across the clouds, not the sound of artillery, but the promise of rain. And somewhere, in the endless march of Krieg's forgotten dead, a nameless soldier might have paused for a moment and smiled behind his mask.